Good afternoon. Welcome to the faculty roundtable portion of this week's CCA. And again, this is the third CCA, if you're keeping track, third CCA of the 2014-2015 academic year. And obviously this one has been on American journalism. My name is Mark Nussbaum. I'm a chair of the chemistry department, but also, more to the point, dean of faculty here at Hillsdale College. And I have the opportunity to introduce the roundtable members and also give a few of my own thoughts, and then we'll turn it over to them. So, again, the purpose of this session is to provide an opportunity for all of us to reflect on things that we've learned, things that we've thought about this week as we've listened to the CCA speakers, and just pick up some key points, questions of interest, etc. So the topic of the CCA, again, obviously has been American journalism and some of its key players. And I just wanted to briefly mention my brother. He's not a, quote, key player, but he's been a journalist for a number of years, basically all of his career at the Philadelphia Inquirer newspaper. And I'm obviously not a journalist, I'm a chemist, but occasionally I'll have opportunity to have conversation with my brother about the state of American journalism. And so we have those conversations every once in a while, and obviously, probably obviously more to the students here than anybody else, technology and social media have really altered the landscape for journalism in America. And the newspaper business especially is in a bad way, deeply, deeply affected by what's been going on in terms of internet and Facebook and all the online blogs and chats. Customers don't want to pay for what they view as a clumsy and slow hard copy of something that they see as being available free online. So my brother, newspaper man that he is, even wryly jokes that the fact that his 21-year-old son is looking for a newspaper job is evidence of, quote, a failure in parenting, he feels. So he's not looking at the prospects for newspaper journalism jobs as being all that wonderful right now. So professional print journalism is in a time of drastic change. Evolve or die, you might say. Similarly, television and radio journalism are having to adjust rapidly as well to the explosion of channels and electronic media. And yet the level of accuracy and professionalism and editorial review of online and electronic materials vary greatly. So how do we as customers ensure that the news sources that we rely on are reliable? Clearly, I'm no expert nor even a well-studied amateur on the topic, but that's the point of this whole session for you and me, people who are just listeners and hoping to be lifelong learners, to think about and express some of our questions, some of our thoughts about this issue. So the CCAs serve to shine light in an area that we might not otherwise study or find ourselves to be experts in. So basically this roundtable session is for you in the audience and for us as well on the roundtable to discuss, to learn from one another and from things that we've picked up and thought about through the week. Now, although I'm not an expert, I should be fair, there are others on this roundtable, especially John Miller, who are indeed experts in the field, so I don't mean to denigrate their expertise. But still, for all of us, we are all learners. We all have room to grow and to learn and to develop. So while the roundtable members are, to some extent, here to teach, it's probably more accurate to see the roundtable as an opportunity to share what we are learning and thinking about in light of what we've seen and heard this week, for the sake of stimulating one another, to stimulating all of us to a deeper understanding. In light of that purpose, we want to hear not only from the roundtable members, but also from you, so there will be a Q&A session at the end of this, towards the latter part of the hour, and then we'll finish up at 5 o'clock. So I'll introduce the faculty panelists now, and each of them will spend 5 to 10 minutes giving their reflections on the CCA, and then I'll open the floor to questions and answers. So we'll go in order here after the introductions. So the first person that you see to my right, your left, is Dr. Peter Blum. He's the director of our Sociology and Social Thought program here at Hillsdale and also professor of philosophy and culture. He's been at Hillsdale since 1992. Pete earned his BA from Goshen College and his MA in philosophy and his PhD in sociology from Notre Dame. He also served as an adjunct at Indiana University and at Spring Arbor University. Then we have Dr. Matthew Young. He's an associate professor of chemistry who's been here since 2007. He earned his bachelor's degree from Seattle Pacific University and his PhD from Northwestern in 2007. He also serves as a science education consultant for the Hillsdale Barney Charter School Initiative. Then Mr. John Miller grew up in Detroit, but now lives out in the sticks of Hillsdale County along a dirt road. So he's gone from the big city to the big outback, if you will, of Hillsdale County. He's the director of the Dow Journalism program here at Hillsdale. And he writes for the National Review, for the Wall Street Journal, and many other publications. John is the author of 5 books, including The First Assassin, a historical thriller set during the Civil War, and The Big Scrum, How Teddy Roosevelt Saved Football. The Chronicle of Higher Education has called him one of the best literary journalists in the country. And to learn more about John Miller and his journalistic endeavors, visit his website, if you're interested, at www.heymiller.com. So we'll proceed in that order with remarks from each. So, Dr. Blum.
Thank you very much. I'd like to thank the organizers for another informative and thought-provoking CCA this week, and Dr. Nussbaum for asking me to be a part of this roundtable. In hearing from me, you hear from someone whose conservatism, if there is such a thing, is the stripe of conservatism that's not so much a position on a political spectrum, but more of an antipathy toward and distrust of the very idea of political positions. For those who want a name to be dropped, I think this puts me in Burke's line, in the general neighborhood that Russell Kirk considered his home, and maybe on the side of town nearest old Michael Oakeshot's place. Now, to be clear, notice that I don't mean to question the existence, or on some level even the practical necessity, of political positions. Stands must be taken, decisions must be made, and evil must not be allowed to flourish through good people doing nothing. But I see little danger in this room this week that we will miss the importance of speaking plainly, seeing what simply is the case, and acting courageously. My tendency is to think, taking a cue from, of all people, Michel Foucault, that everything is dangerous. Now, Foucault, as some of you might know, was no political conservative. He identified himself often in practice with the European political left. But as I and some other people have tried to point out elsewhere, it's quite misleading to see Foucault's work as ideologically left. And it is a valuable resource for insights that may be just as friendly to a conservative temperament, as his critics who identify themselves as leftist have often noticed. From Foucault, I've picked up a tendency to look always for danger, even in the ways that we look for and try to work against danger. I have long understood this tendency to be entirely consistent with my admiration for Kirk, who seems about as often to have puzzled and disconcerted other conservatives as he has given them genuine insight and inspiration. You should watch for Bradley Berzer's biography of Kirk, which is forthcoming, I understand, from the University Press of Kentucky. Now, such a conservative orientation, if it's left to itself, seems to keep making things difficult and complex, when others really would like to keep it simple and do what needs to be done. I myself am quite bad at allowing things to be simple. I'm pretty good at making things more difficult and complex. I hope you know that's not necessarily the requirement to be a good professor, but I happen to be good at it. But I need those of you who tend to lose patience with that kind of complexity. And I realize that if it were only up to me, probably nothing would get done, and a lot of evil would flourish. But right now, at this moment in this place, I've been given my 10 minutes, and while I do want to applaud the desire for simple clarity and resolute action, I will briefly indulge my determined delight in difficulty. So bear with me. My concern is with how we must deal with the common oversimplification involved in the contrast between conservatives, that's us, and liberals, that's them if you're taking notes. This simplified schema has hovered over the entire week, though I think it's fair to say that it was especially overt in Hugh Hewitt's lecture on talk radio. The fact that it is an oversimplification is something all of us know, I suspect. I don't need to act as though I'm identifying it, even in this particular context, and even more often in the Q&A session. It's always been there, sometimes explicitly, but I can't help myself. I'm sorry. I have to do a bit of underlining. I especially felt my complexity complex beginning to boil at the idea of quantifying and measuring a precise level of conservatism, like taking someone's temperature on a specified scale, Fahrenheit or Celsius. Now, it can be very helpful to quantify and measure all kinds of things, don't get me wrong. And I do not mean to suggest that Tim Grossklose's study is without significant worth. But I see a danger, remember that word, danger, in remembering and promulgating the quantitative characterization of the influence of media bias that he provided, but forgetting, or at least minimizing, some of what we heard in the Q&A regarding the dimensions of the matter at hand that had to be omitted or ignored for sound methodological reasons, or refraining from mentioning that the level of confidence in the measurement's precision is not as high as one would like. Or, to me, the most striking point from that discussion, how the margin for error might be wide enough to pull the result pretty far toward educated guess territory, despite the scientific clothing that it wears. I think the more important place to point to, though, if it's complexity that I'm after, is last night's talk on Mencken by Fred Siegel. I think that there is where we heard the most overt willingness to own the complications that can be covered over by the simplified schema. I'm not in a position to give any decisive judgment on Siegel's historical claims about Mencken's influence, though they are consistent with my amateur impressions, the ones I already had. What I would especially urge you to notice explicitly is how he cast his argument conceptually. The distinction between political liberalism and cultural liberalism that he supposed, though it was not what he was centrally concerned with in arguing, it was deployed for us in such a way, I'd suggest, that it was to a substantial degree motivated, you might say, by how it made sense of Mencken's influence across superficially ideological lines. Conservatives who are familiar with how cultural conservatism, which itself has multiple streams, is not always a comfortable companion of political conservatism, also having more than one stream. That's something we know about. I'm afraid that there is danger in not remembering that the same is true, broadly speaking, of what we call liberalism. That's, I think, part of what his talk reminded us of. The complication gets worse, of course, along the path that I'm pointing out here. My view, for example, is that being conservative and being liberal, in some widely accepted uses of those terms, are completely compatible. Regarding such problems of demarcation and differentiation, I recommend that you read an essay by the Polish philosopher Leszek Kolakowski. The essay is called How to Be a Conservative Liberal Socialist. It's a wonderful little essay. It's only a couple of pages long, but it packs a powerful punch, as most all of Kolakowski's writings do. For those of you who don't know, Kolakowski was originally a Marxist, and he wrote, at the time that he was actually moving away from Marxism, rejecting it, he wrote a 3-volume study of the history of Marxism that still, as far as I know, is one of the sort of magisterial studies of the history of Marxism. His writings since that time should be of a lot of interest to cultural conservatives. Now, I might be closing in on the end of my time limit. Do I intend to invalidate the simplified schema that Mr. Hewitt so artfully employed? No. Do I intend to suggest that anyone here is wrong to think that Hillsdale's journalism program, under John Miller's capable leadership, should not be applauded for aspiring to correct the imbalance that worries us all so much? By no means. Do I intend to suggest that the dangers we all want to address forthrightly and passionately are not real dangers? Absolutely not. So what's your point, Blum? Friedrich Nietzsche said that if one fights monsters, one must take care that one does not also become a monster. Among other things, this suggests the need to take care in defining what is and what is not a monster, and perhaps the need to take care in defining the extent to which what we are fighting, or better, the extent to which who we are fighting is a monster. Let us remember that. I'm fairly certain that our excellent journalism program, in partnership with our liberal arts corps, does cultivate the remembrance of that. As we cheer for our side in what is often painted as a battle against monsters, let us all help to make sure that it stays that way. Thank you for listening.
Good afternoon. Over the past 3 days, we have heard interesting and wide-ranging discussion on journalism. We've heard about journalism in the founding era, the resistance of government to transparency for journalists, metrics of the influence of journalists on the people, important characteristics that conservative journalists have, the importance of the First Amendment in the history of journalism, and the influences behind the development of cultural liberalism in America. And through these talks, one thing that we've clearly seen is that journalism has been and continues to be very important in shaping society. And that's no surprise. It's the primary way we get information and opinion on what's happening in the world. I, like Dr. Nussbaum pointed out, am of course not a journalist, and I don't have any particular expertise in journalism. And in fact, I should give a disclaimer, not only that, I am not what you would consider a news junkie, and I should admit I don't consume as much good journalism as I probably should. My interest in journalism is simply the basic idea that I want to know what's happening in the world and what it means. And so in the next few minutes, I simply want to offer a few basic thoughts on the talks that we've heard over the last 3 days. The first observation that I'd like to make is the connection between the great power of journalism and the virtue of journalists. In the opening talk of the CCA, Mr. Brookhiser illustrated 4 different aspects of journalists, by giving us examples from the founding era of America. These aspects or characteristics of journalists that he discussed were attacking, amusing, instructing, and inspiring. And he gave anecdotes illustrating each of these aspects in historical figures. And we saw that each of the figures had a large influence through their writing. We saw that Dr. Grosclose argued that it can be measured that the media leans to the left of center on average, as measured by the PQ, or the political quotient of the people, via a questionnaire about bills that have been before Congress, and the SQ, or the slant quotient of the media, which was a metric he developed based on references to various think tanks by newspapers. And the main idea there was that media bias has an effect on the PQ of the people, which he measured through this media lambda, which was based on 3 studies that were something like experiments on how people respond to the media that they consume. The numerical values he gave didn't seem very meaningful because of the high uncertainties. But the overall point that the media can have an impact on the political views of the people is compelling. Also in the talk last night, we heard how the writing of H.L. Mencken had a tremendous impact on the American left. And so we see that journalism can do great things, and journalism can do not so great things. I thought this was especially interesting in this area of the attack aspect of journalism. And I think it raises the question, can the attack aspect be done well? The examples that were given were well written, but they were not done well in the sense that I have in mind. However, I do think that I think that it can, but I think that it's a fine line to walk. Mr. Brookhiser mentioned in the Q&A, he said, quote, "There is something disreputable about journalism," end quote. Almost like there is an unavoidable seedy side to the enterprise. He said that journalists tell things that people don't want known, but this can be important. Additionally, Mr. Brookhiser discussed Hamilton, raising the question, can societies establish good government through reflection and choice? And he went on through his papers to answer that question, and so that question has been answered. But we can consider that question because it's now up to us to recover and to maintain good government through reflection and choice. And this, of course, is done in part by reading information and thoughtful arguments and reflecting on them, and then making informed choices. So, how can journalists implement these 4 aspects of journalism well in our day? It seems to me that the answer comes from the primary themes of Mr. Hewitt's talk. He talked about rectitude, which he defined as virtue supported by external bearing. When he was talking about conservatives in talk radio, he made the claim that their success was due to the fact that 1, they know what they're talking about, and 2, they are authentically what they say they are. Additionally, he had 5 challenges for young journalists. The first was to be good, to be people of virtue. The second was to be gracious. Here he talked about modeling a thoughtful conversation with liberals on his show, which was one of my favorite comments that he made. It seems to me there's so much shouting and name-calling and ripping apart of straw men that goes on. And one of the greatest skills that one can develop is the ability to engage in interesting and respectful dialogue with someone that you disagree with. The third thing that the third challenge that he gave was to be grateful for opportunities that you have and remember who has helped you along the way. The fourth was to work hard. And this kind of reminded me that all excellent journalism is the product of hard work. And in fact, in Mr. Brookhiser's talk, he observed that journalism can do great things, but journalists don't always have good lives, when he talked about the end of the lives of his 4 examples. And that reminded me that good journalism is an important service to the society. I would think that it would, or at least could be, fulfilling work, but it's also hard work. long hours requiring sacrifice. And I think this is true whether your subject is sports, developments in science, developments in politics, or something else. The fifth challenge that Mr. Hewitt gave for young journalists was to actually believe in the importance of what you're doing. He phrased it as, if we lose, America loses. And by we, I think he means conservative journalists or maybe conservatives in general. And so these characteristics that Mr. Hewitt laid out for journalists allow the four aspects of journalism for Mr. Brookhiser to be done in a way that points toward what is good and what is true. They even allow for the attack aspect, which I take to mean uncovering impropriety, to be done without malice or without an intent to mislead. And so, in short, what we need is men and women in journalism who are good, decent, well-educated, and have integrity. And in fact, we need people like this in all fields of study, and this is what we're about at Hillsdale. Just a couple of other comments. If we go back to this idea of being gracious, one of the striking themes I thought last night regarding Mencken was his disdain for the people. In fact, the speaker mentioned a couple of times this phrase that Mencken had, the bourgeoisie, referring to the middle class. And we've heard in a couple of the talks that this is something that persists in liberal ideology. This idea that people are too stupid to know what they need or to know what they want or should want from their leaders. And we should reject this, and we should demand journalism that shows respect for its audience, and of course leaders who show respect for the people. We heard in this, kind of what Dr. Nussbaum alluded to in his intro, we heard several mentions, but not a lot of discussion, of Facebook and Twitter and how important they are or how important they'll be in the future. I am speaking in almost complete ignorance on this, but I thought it was interesting, and I don't know how important they will be in the long term or how useful they will be. But I did want to say in the short term, I would encourage students to not rely too heavily on those as your sources for good writing. Maybe they're useful in other ways, but just because we have Twitter doesn't mean that we have to all be on Twitter all of the time. And more generally, I encourage you, students, to seek thoughtful information from a variety of sources, and not to just seek your own opinion when you're reading about reflections on what's happening in the world, looking only for your own opinion being reflected back to you. I think reading different viewpoints can broaden your understanding and sharpen your thinking. I think we've heard throughout the 3 days of some of the excellent writing at the Wall Street Journal, National Review, the telecasts on Fox News, and of course, conservative talk radio. I would encourage you to add to that, as just a couple of examples, lots of great things out there, but to add to that the thoughtful commentary and interesting discussion that can be found on The Atlantic or NPR. It won't hurt anything. Thank you.
A few months ago, Gallup, the polling company, put out a survey. You can look it up online. And the headline of its press release says it all. Trust in mass media returns to all-time low. It said that it measured Americans' trust in the media. It found that only, as it reported, only 40% have a great deal or a fair amount of trust in the media. The better way to put it, the journalistic way to put it, I think, would be 60% have not very much or no trust at all in the media. That's an all-time low. One of the curiosities, when you look longitudinally, when you look at this, trust in the media tends to dip during election years, and then it goes up in non-election years. And so when you see the graph, they ask this question every year. When you look at the graph, it looks like the blade of a saw kind of turned upside down, peaks and valleys, peaks and valleys. So we'll probably have a little more trust in the media this year, but there's a long-term downward trend. There are a lot of reasons why that's probably true. Many of them having to do with journalism. I think a few of them actually having to do with larger questions. But there you go. And this survey brought to mind for me a comment Rick Brookhiser made in the first lecture of the CCA, and it's a comment Matt just referred to himself a moment ago, which is that there's something a little disreputable about journalists and journalism, something a little bit disreputable. And I think there's a lot of truth in what he says, but I'm going to push back against that claim a little bit. And in the process of pushing back against that claim, I hope maybe tease out a few themes from the last 3 days of this CCA and with some very different speakers and topics and so forth. Maybe find some things that bring them all together. So is journalism disreputable? Well, maybe. Now here at Hillsdale College, we make a big deal of statesmanship, right? We have a graduate school of statesmanship. We have a campus dotted with statues of statesmen. Well, we know statesmanship is a high and noble calling. These are good things to study and emulate and learn about and so on and so forth. But we also know there are plenty of crooked politicians in the world. In fact, the front page of today's New York Post, the newspaper founded by Alexander Hamilton, the front page of today's New York Post, the top story is not the mountains of snow that kept Bret Stephens from joining us here this week. It's about the leader of the state Senate resigning in a corruption scandal, an alleged corruption scandal. One of the most powerful men, sort of a legendarily powerful man in New York State politics resigning. So he may not be a statesman. He's a Democrat, but it's not just Democrats who are this way. A month ago, a Republican congressman resigned because he's been convicted or indicted in tax fraud. Michael Grimm resigned his seat in Congress. So there are crooked politicians or allegedly crooked politicians in both parties. We know that. And yet we still look for statesmen. When we think about 2016, who's going to run for president, who's going to win, we all do it with an eye toward hoping maybe a statesman will emerge and do something good for this country. So there are crooked politicians, but we're always looking for statesmen too. And we can look for great journalism, and we know how much we need it. President Arndt said something on this stage yesterday that's kind of obvious, although it never occurred to me. Freedom of the press is in the First Amendment. The First Amendment has a kind of pride of place, doesn't it? It's not a randomly assigned amendment. It's not the Fifth Amendment, the Seventh Amendment, the 10th. It's the First Amendment. And some of our most important freedoms are in that amendment. He explained why. Well, that's where you find freedom of the press, and that's how important the press is and journalism is to a free society. Now, when we define journalism, in a lot of ways we can define journalism. A kind of popular way of doing this is saying journalism is history's first rough draft. Right? Journalists write the rough draft of history. Someone would take that and say, well, yeah. A different way of looking at it, someone has said, learning about, a more pejorative way, learning about our world through journalism is like trying to tell the time by looking at the second hand on a clock, right? First draft of history, you look at, how much can you really interpret from that? And there's sometimes a tendency not to take journalism seriously. It's ephemeral, it's forgettable, it's fish wrapped by Friday. I know that's what you guys do with your collegians on Friday, use it for cat litter. Fish wrapped by Friday, we say of newspapers. There can be a tendency not to take it seriously. But the great journalism is something more. Bret Stephens couldn't join us, of course, but he had his column appeared in the Wall Street Journal yesterday. I don't know who saw it. It's a great column, as so many of his are. It's on the election that just took place in Greece. He explained what happened. He interpreted it for us. It was very smart, but it's about more than that, too. If you read deeply, and it's only 700 or 800 words long, but it's also about the nature of capitalism. The importance of capitalism is about corruption. It's about many, many things, and at the end, it was just telling us what to make of this election in Greece, what it means for the EU, what it means for global finances, and on and on and on. In 800 words, he did an awful lot. In my classrooms, when I define journalism, I like to call it the literature of what just happened. And I also like to place emphasis on the word literature. Now, not every piece of journalism, in fact, the overwhelming majority of it is not what we would call great literature. It's just stuff we want to read and informs us about our world. But we know it can be great literature. And Rick Brookhiser reminded us of this on Sunday when he quoted Tom Paine. These are the times that try men's souls, he said. And he read that whole paragraph, that whole first paragraph of the American Crisis. And he said something that really struck me. I'd never thought of it before. It's a paragraph I've told my students to read over and over again. In fact, I've made some of them memorize it for midterms. It's a great paragraph. He said it's Shakespearean. Remember that? He said it reminds him of the St. Crispin's Day speech in Henry V. Now, that's some pretty high praise. Tom Paine playing on the same field as William Shakespeare. He also went on to say we couldn't sustain it, right? I wouldn't say Paine is the equal of Shakespeare, but my, what a great moment he had with that paragraph. You could also say it was Churchillian, that paragraph, a kind of fighting spirit behind it at a critical moment. But it was journalism. And so when we hear people talk about mere journalists or mere journalism, I think of a line by a music critic, a British music critic named Ernest Newman, and he said, "Journalist is a term of contempt employed by writers who are not read about writers who are." Now, you guys, most of you are students, you've been walking around campus all school year, and you've probably seen these posters we put up for the Collegian with these famous people pointing out that they're journalists, right? Yes, we've seen these things. You know, Reagan, Churchill, Orwell, Twain, all journalists, right? And you know what it is, kind of a recruitment poster for the Collegian. Just trying to persuade some of you guys to come out and write for the Collegian a little bit, do some good work there. But the fundamental point is the one I'm trying to make here, which is great literature can come out of journalism. Some of the best things that have been thought and said have been done through journalism. And I can go on and on and on with examples. I could tell you we have 8 of those posters up now. There are more coming. We're going to keep doing this series. I'm going to read you 3 more that I plan soon. Milton was a journalist. Before he wrote Paradise Lost, John Milton wrote political pamphlets on free speech and divorce. Swift was a journalist. Before he wrote Gulliver's Travels and A Modest Proposal, Jonathan Swift was the editor of a Tory newspaper in London. Publius was a journalist. Before the Federalist Papers were bound up in books, they were published as op-eds in 18th century newspapers. So when we think of some of these writers, Milton, Swift, Publius, and so forth, we think of our Norton Anthology of Literature or the Federalist Papers in your the reader they make, the Constitution reader they make you guys read. They don't look like journalism when you get them that way, but they really are the products of journalism. They are great journalism. They're the kind of journalism we should hope to have more of. I mean, can you imagine a world without these writers, without these works? It's unimaginable. These kinds of journalists help us see the whole clock, not just the second hand. That's the very best kind of journalism. General observation about some of the topics, which could on first glance see kind of scattered and all over the place. When we look at the problems of journalism, the challenges of journalism, we see the problems of today are the problems of yesterday. Some people say the past is a foreign country. The idea being when you look at the past, it is so hard to interpret. It's like going to a foreign land. You can't possibly understand. It's an alien culture. The past is a foreign country, people say. But sometimes when you look at the past really close, you get a sense of deja vu. And it reminds you of the world we inhabit right now. In fact, it seems incredibly familiar because they fight about the same things we fight about right now. John Milton, when he was a political pamphleteer, was talking about divorce. Or he's talking about the ingredients of a free society, the need for a free press. We fight about these things right now. Jonathan Swift, in A Modest Proposal, was dealing with the problem of the poor. What do we do about the poor? That's a problem that will never go away. And Publius, of course, dealing with the nature of government. What kind of government do we want? We fight about that now too. The fights are the same in so many cases. Now, their influence is always in dispute. We had a lecture last night on H.L. Mencken as a kind of founding father of modern liberalism. We look at a figure like James Callender. He's the muckraking journalist from the founding era that Rick Brookhiser talked about. Remember, he's the guy who broke the news of Alexander Hamilton's adultery and Thomas Jefferson's purported relationship with the slave Sally Hemings. Are we glad he did those things? Does private morality influence public character? Those are questions they were dealing with right then. We deal with them right now all the time with our public figures. Does their private behavior matter in terms of their public character? Should we draw lines between them or not? It's the same thing. Cheryl Atkinson seems to me like a reporter who doesn't have a political bone in her body. Remember, she resisted. I think some people asked her questions, sort of baited her to come out and say, right-wingy kinds of things, opportunities to give the Hillsdale crowd what it wants to hear, and she completely resisted that, didn't she? And does that make her an ideal reporter, an ideal, ideally objective? Well, maybe it makes her a good one, I think. We want all kinds of reporters. I like Tim Grossklose's presentation on media bias. I like Pete a little bit. I'm a little skeptical of the numbers. Numbers frighten and confuse me, just as a general rule. But I think Tim is right on the big question. I'm not quite sure he proved it. Right? You ever do a math? Your math problems are saying, show your proof. Sometimes you get the answer right, but you can't show your proof. I had a little sense of that. Tim's a smart guy, though, and I think he's on to something. But I share some of Pete's reservations at the same time. Is talk radio a medium of partisan slummers? We hear that kind of accusation all the time. Or does a guy like Hugh Hewitt actually elevate the kind of conversation and educate us and make us better citizens when we listen to him? And so on and so forth. I'm going to close with a line from Tocqueville, another guy you guys can't escape Hillsdale without reading a little bit of him. He has a big, thick book on democracy in America, of course. Spent some time over here. In fact, if de Tocqueville was alive today, he might not have written a big book. I think when he traveled through America, he might have just blogged his way through America with his observations, right? That maybe is what he would have done today. But he wrote his book back then. We study it now. Tocqueville understood the importance of newspapers and a free press in the United States. He understood how it contributes to civil society, how we need it for discourse, how to communicate with each other, and why every informed citizen needs to read newspapers. He was talking about newspapers because that's what they were back then, but needs to stay informed through journalism is how you might put it more generally. He said this of newspapers: we should underrate their importance if we thought they just guaranteed liberty. They maintain civilization, he said. They maintain civilization. They certainly maintain our American civilization, I think. So I hope you've enjoyed the CCA this week, and I think we'll take questions.
Thank you, John, and each of the panelists. So now we would like to open it up for questions from the audience, and so there are a couple of our students with microphones. So as has been the case throughout the week, if you have a question, please raise your hand and wait for the person to come with the microphone, and then if you could, go ahead and stand up and give your question or comment. And you can direct those questions, comments to the panel as a whole, or if you have a specific person in mind that you'd like to address it to, just go ahead and do so. So. Floor is open, and again, we'll wrap it up around 5 o'clock.
Okay, my question has to do with Dr. Arnn and Mr. Hewitt's discussion yesterday about Snowden. More so because I was thinking about, like, if we think back to Woodward and Bernstein and Deep Throat and what he did, I mean, it's obviously a different situation. It's like but it's still a national secret, and it was still someone inside the government that knew that something he morally thought was going wrong and then leaked it to a newspaper to spread that information. So is there like any correlation there, and how should that inform how to be a good journalist, like, was what Deep Throat did wrong and what Woodward and Bernstein did wrong, the same way that we're saying what Snowden and the New York Times did was wrong?
I do think they're different cases. Woodward and Bernstein were not dealing with national security secrets for one thing. A better example from that era would be the Pentagon Papers during the Vietnam War, if you want kind of a closer parallel. I'll say this, I just made the point that the fights of yesterday, the fights of today, these are the sorts of tensions we're dealing with all the time. In my history journalism class, which you should take, Natalie, the first thing students read is Areopagitica by John Milton, which is about the importance of a free press. And it's about the fact that in Milton's time, to publish, you had to be licensed. Imagine a newspaper having to seek a license from the government in order to publish. And Milton was saying this is wrong. We shouldn't have licensing of newspapers, and saying why the free exchange of ideas is good for society and helps us reach the truth is what he argues. But then, of course, there are always exceptions, and there are exceptions to the exceptions, and you get into these problems with national security secrets, and it seems like we get into them more and more and more as technology advances, and so on and so forth. And I have some opinions about Snowden, and so, but I think the general rule needs to be what President Arndt said: is we need people of good judgment in government to know when to prosecute, when to not prosecute. And also people of good judgment in journalism to know when to print and when not to print. And we won't always get it right, and there will be hard choices to make, but we can be better or worse based upon sound judgment.
I'd like to thank all of you guys for coming out today and providing your reaction. My question is going to go a lot back to the Dr. Arndt conversation that happened yesterday, but I think it's very relevant that we talk about this. So in Locke's second treatise of civil government in chapter 11, he talks about this non-delegation power, that people can't give power to the government that they themselves don't have. So when we think about that, I, in the state of nature, cannot censor the press. However, we see our government does this all the time. My question to you and each of you is, where does that power of press censorship come from, and how can we work to restrain that back in from a citizenry perspective? Thank you.
I'll start with the observation, I don't think the press is censored all the time. In fact, I think certainly in the United States, the press is censored almost not at all. The censorship, if you want to call it that, there may be some self-censorship. Judgments about what belongs in print and what doesn't belong in print. But we have reasonable rules about libel and slander and so forth, but it's very hard not to print almost anything in the United States. And I've not read John Locke's second treatise in about 25 years, so I'm not going to step into that territory.
This question might be for Dr. Young, since you said that you're not a big news junkie or journalist yourself, but I felt like the speakers gave really good advice for journalists, like Mr. Brookhiser and the 4 things that journalists do, and Mr. Hewitt's advice for journalists. But what about those here that aren't trying to be journalists themselves, but are just trying to interpret the news? What do you think are the main points that could be gathered from the speakers in that term?
Well, I think part of it is looking for sources that embody those characteristics that were mentioned. And I really appreciated what John said about the literature focus. And I think that there's something to be said for good writing in journalism. But also just the character aspect. I mean, I thought that a lot of what Mr. Hewitt talked about was the rectitude, the virtue. And so that's not maybe super easy to identify, but I think that's something to look for. Someone who's writers who are thoughtful, not only smart, but thoughtful, and seem to be people of virtue. And I think, to be honest, from my perspective, you can find people like that with a variety of political persuasions.
I'll jump in with a comment there. One great thing you can do as consumers of news is read all kinds of ideas, including ones you disagree with. I mean, I write for National Review. I think everybody should read National Review. When I read the Wall Street Journal editorial page, I feel like I'm at home in terms of political opinion and so forth. But it's critically important to look at what other people are saying. And one of the there's a bit of good news buried in here, because we're always hearing so much about how partisan the United States has become, how we can't, it's a 50-50 nation, left, right, we're talking past each other all the time. I think there's a fair amount of truth in all that. But if you drill down and look at some figures on how people actually interpret the news, how they get their news, and so forth, conservatives are much more likely to read liberal opinion, and liberals are much more likely to read conservative opinion than the great middle is likely to read either. And we see a good deal of curiosity on both sides. They want to know what other people are thinking. They want to engage in ideas, and I think that's a kind of hopeful sign. And the real problem, in some ways, we have a big left-right problem in America, and we can talk about that for a long time. But there's another kind of problem, which is just a misinformation problem and an apathy problem, and people who don't care about ideas. But I would encourage people to read on the right and read on the left and read on the up and down and all over the spectrum that Pete says doesn't exist, and everywhere.
Well, it turns into a web instead of a spectrum. It goes in a bunch of different directions as opposed to one continuum. But I think this is right. This cannot be you cannot overemphasize the importance. The way I'd put it is that if you think about the people who you most admire as thinkers who have things to say, they are the sorts of people always who have learned from stuff that they totally disagree with. That's how it works. I'm in sociology. I teach sociology, and there are studies. They're controversial. It's unclear how accurate the measurement is there, but there are studies that everybody's talking about that do suggest that it's becoming more common that people who consume opinion, good opinion journalism, it's narrowing, and people read less stuff that differs from their own point of view than used to be the case, especially maybe in what you're calling the middle. No, we may not know for sure how much that's happening, but enough people are wondering if it's happening and worrying about it. All of us know people who don't seem to pay much attention to things that they don't agree with, at least a few, right? And I think whether or not it's actually happening, the fact that we're becoming aware of it as an issue is absolutely critical. Central to being a liberally educated person, in the sense that Hillsdale wants you to be, is being the sort of person who has learned from a wide swath of perspectives that encompass, that make up our tradition. People who don't agree with each other, and yet who we consider very much architects, a part of our tradition. Part of what makes it so difficult to be able, for you students, to be able to look Dr. Arnn in the eye when he sits down at your table in the dining hall and asks you, what is the good? And you'll seize up and like, I don't know. And you feel like you're supposed to know. But part of the point of him asking you, of course, is that it's important to get a hold on how difficult it is and how lifelong a struggle it is to try to figure that out. That doesn't mean that you can't know anything about it. It doesn't mean that you don't move toward it. But I think it's central to moving toward it. That's part of my point, I think, about monsters. Sometimes when we define monsters, we can't learn from them. And it's clear that a lot of people, even when they end up thinking that Mencken, for example, is someone who has had influence that we don't like in many ways, yet these same people are people who have learned from him. who admire his writing and try to understand what he's up to. So,
hi, so along the same stream of thought that we've been talking about just now, I'm curious about bias. In the last couple days, it's emerged that there seems to be an interaction between inform and persuasion when it comes to the purpose for journalism. So where would you say that the balance lies there, and what is the appropriate interaction between those two when it comes to journalism and reporting?
I think you want both. I think any good publication that seeks to interpret the world fully is going to have a news section and an editorial section. I think the great newspapers all do that. So I think you want both, and I think sometimes it's hard to. You want opinion sections that are actually have fact and are evidence-based and informative. And in a news section, I think you want some pretty straight, objective news reporting on the one hand. On the other hand, you want reporters with a kind of sensibility to ask certain kinds of questions and make sound judgments that'll help us interpret the news. So there's a kind of a blending that can take place, but we can make some real distinctions between news and opinion.
Brookhiser presented to us what I found really striking and compelling sort of situation in the early American Republic, where he portrayed it. I don't know for sure that if this is overstated or not, but he portrayed this situation in which everybody just kind of knew that everybody's got a perspective. Everybody knew that the different news sources had a perspective and that those perspectives differed. And at some level, people weren't worried about everybody being objective. And my sense is that part of what's striking about that is that probably is a lot better way to get towards something like objectivity if we accept that, if we also look at all the perspectives as opposed to limiting ourselves.
And we're actually returning to that model in terms of
Yeah,
journalism.
there's reason to think so.
With the diversity in the news industry right now, it looks journalism today looks more like the founding era than ever before, and the way it looked 50 years ago, I think we will never return to again. The notion that there's a handful of news outlets, there's a sort of a false idea of objectivity. I think it's better now. It's not without its problems, not without its gigantic problems, but it's a better way to get information now.
I mean, everybody kind of knows now that in that era, I'll ask John, isn't this right? And that was the era when everybody now knows there was an immense amount of self-censorship in the media, in some areas especially. There were things that were politely not reported. And as we look back, that may have made sense in some ways, but we worry about that.
James Callender would have had fun with the Kennedy White House.
Oh yeah.
If that's what you mean.
Yes, that's one of the things I had in mind, yes.
Go ahead, here in front.
I think you finally hit the rich vein here, because this is the question I wanted to pose. Fred Siegel last night used the expression, just in response to a question, practice evidence-based journalism. And that expression encompasses a lot more than may appear at first, because that could cover both an opinion piece and a so-called objective news report. The difficulty, in my view, is that because objective news reporting has been so heavily sold, the public has come until recently to rely almost entirely on the news pages and ignore the editorial pages. In fact, back when I was a journalism student many years ago, they did readership surveys and found out that the least read portion of the newspaper was the editorial page. Because after all, that's merely opinion. And yet, when a news reporter makes a decision to report a story, or an editor gives them that assignment, there's a judgment there, and we all know that, and it goes all through it. So whether you're writing an opinion or whether you're simply presenting information, evidence is central to it, and a conclusion is always to be drawn from it. So I think if that idea is taken to heart, that can, shall we say, bless the whole enterprise, just like it should.
Yeah, I second that. I thought that was a nice comment, and I like that idea of when you're writing something, however you classify it, addressing the issue of what makes you think that might be the case. Any claim you make, backing it up with evidence.
One of our problems in relation to that is not only whether people can capably present evidence, it's also the case that, again, I think it's hard to be sure how much effect this has, but I think it's the case that there are many people in our society nowadays whose cynicism has gotten deep enough that even if you present evidence well, there's a kind of a predisposition to think that, well, you can't know, or to think that the evidence, that one person's source of evidence is as good as anyone else's. I'm sure this is probably the case. I'm hoping that one of the things we're doing for our students at Hillsdale, as well as that present evidence, is that you can consider and be a consumer of evidence as well. So it's double-edged.
Time for just one more question.
I would like to ask Dr. Blum, when thinking about the 4 types of journalism that Mr. Brookhiser talked about, do you think that these 4 virtues reveal anything significant or unique about our society? And how does this compare to other societies around the globe?
Insofar as I have what could count as expertise in sociology, it tends not to be in that area. I can give you impressions of what I think sort of people would think in sociology. I think there are a lot of people in sociology who would be in looking at cross-cultural comparisons, they probably would have a tendency to discount as a sort of a value judgment the degree to which they're discerning differences that might be sort of authoritarian differences, sort of differences between what we would call a free press and what elsewhere they would consider sort of a press that's controlled by a government. There's only so much that you can do to ignore this kind of thing. But I think there is a kind of a tendency sometimes to believe that those sort of judgments, that the press is or is not being curtailed, as sort of value judgments that should be sort of avoided, or that one should be really careful and deft with, when probably, in fact, they're just judgments about what's really going on. One of the things that I hope that journalists won't be afraid to do is to make those kind of judgments. In terms of those virtues, part of what that means is that those virtues are going to look very different in different cultural contexts. I think that there are going to be contexts in which the virtues of journalism are going to look more like vices, right? Or they're at least going to look like something that needs to be curtailed and kept under wraps. And one of the things that I think for objectivity, not just for freedom, but for objectivity, one of the things that we probably need to do is cultivate the idea that seeing those as virtues is not just a value judgment, like we think that, but over there they don't think that, but to push the idea that there is really something about cultivating those virtues that gives you an edge in really understanding what's going on, that it's not just a matter of differing in value judgment. I hope that was coherent. That was just off the top of my head. Does that sort of speak to your question to some extent? As a non-expert opinion, but sort of knowing what's going on in sociology.
All right. Thank you very much. Again, we'll be dismissed, but feel free to come up if you have questions afterwards and speak to any of the panelists. Thank you.